Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to another episode here with some Pod Limit Omaha content. Hope you are all doing well and that you started 2023 with a lot of positivity and great energy. So I want to start off this new year with a topic that I hear a lot of people having a lot of questions about. And it's definitely one of the things that is asked to me the most often by the community, and that is, should I bet or should I check my hand on this flop? Now, today I'm going to use one hand history here to shine some light on this and give all of you some practical tips and ideas on how to have an easier life and decision basically next time you sit at the table. So guys, let's get right into it. If you like this type of content, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. I want to start off today, guys, with a quiz. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to test all of you on what you currently know and understand about flop C betting, and also how you are currently coming up with an answer to that decision. So let's look into the hand. I open raise early position and the big blind calls. The board is queen 9 deuce with a suit. Big blind checks and I have a decision. As you can see, I'm not showing the hand yet, at least. And I'm doing that on purpose because before revealing the hand, I want to ask you, how do you come up with an answer to the question of, should I bet or should I check my specific hand on a certain board texture? What are the things you are going through when you are making that decision? You, of course, have a short time window when you're playing poker. So within that time window, you have to go through a couple of decision points to eventually come up with the decision, hey, or with the answer, I'm betting or I'm checking here. So feel free to pause the video, guys, for a second if you want to, because it is helpful to actively think about questions like this, because it will test you of how do you do that currently. Now, I hope you did that, of course, because it is in a way a important decision. It's a conceptual decision in a way, and something that will help you throughout a lot of decisions within poker, because quite often very often what you should and want to do when you have a decision to make is, first of all, not look at your specific hand, but zoom out a little bit and think bigger picture. Think about how does your range interact to a board texture and how does your opponent's range interact to a board texture. And based on that, you can already learn a lot about your overall range play. Let me give you an example about this. We're open raising early position and the big blind calls. Again, same situation, but instead of the board being queen 9 deuce with a suit, the board would be ace king deuce. So we now have two very high cards. One is an ace, and because that is the case, the tight open raising range of the early position player, myself in this case, will interact very strongly to that board texture. And because that is the case, you will have a very high equity advantage and a very high polarity advantage, meaning the early position player will have a lot more strong hands on ace king deuce than the big blind. And because his advantage in equity and polarity is so large, he can actually c-bet with an extremely high frequency on that specific board texture. Now let's change the board to queen 9 deuce. In this situation, early position, yes, he will have some very strong hands on this board texture, but a lot of his hands in his range now don't interact extremely strong with the board texture. And because that is the case, his overall equity advantage is dropping. And he also doesn't have as many strong hands as he would have, for example, on ace king deuce. And because that is the case, his overall c-bet frequency has to drop. It cannot remain the same because those two parameters, equity and polarity, are significantly worse on this board texture. All I'm saying here is that The interaction of ranges with a certain flop will have a massive effect on your overall strategy, and we're not even talking about your specific hand. So let's imagine we now know more about Queen 9 deuce. We know that we do have an equity advantage, but the equity advantage is not super high. And secondly, we don't necessarily have a large polarity advantage. We won't have way more queens or nines or deuces or queen 9 on this specific texture. And therefore, we don't get that massive boost to c-bet with a very high frequency. Now, if I ask you how often would you c-bet with your entire range on Queen 9 deuce, what is the answer? Because in reality, we should only c-bet roughly 44% of the time on this board texture. That is not that high, right? Especially if you compare it to, for example, an ace-high board, which is significantly more often a c-bet. Okay, so we know that we're not betting extremely often, only 44%. And it's very easy to come up with the idea of, hey, I have a tight open raising range. My range is stronger than the big blind, so I can do a lot of betting. But in reality, you have to be quite selective still. Now, the next step for you is to think about a smaller frame, right? So you thought about your overall range. Now let's zoom in again. You have a specific hand. Let's show the hand in question here. Let's see, we're gonna show my hand. My hand is King, King, Jack 3. So we have a very strong hand because we have a flush draw, a gut shot to the nut straight. We have a backdoor flush draw. So we have a ton of additional things going on. But before answering the question of should we bet or check my hand, let's look into a little bit of a bigger frame. How would we play this specific hand class? And the hand class here is an overpair with a flush draw. So if we look into all the overpairs with a flush draw, you have to consider that a lot of the overpairs with a flush draw are very dependent on the strength of the flush draw and the strength of the side cards in whether you want to bet or check. So for example, my hand, King, King, Jack 3, we have a high flush draw, we have a backdoor flush draw, and we have a nut gut shot plus the overpair. And all those things combined make this specific hand quite an easy c-bet. And I think most of you guys will agree. But let's change the overpair. Let's say we have King, King, 6, 5 with a 6 high flush draw. That hand is significantly worse even though we have the same hand class, right? We have an overpair and a flush draw. But that specific hand doesn't want to bet and build a pot because that hand doesn't push much equity versus your opponent's overall range. That hand doesn't do much better if your opponent's range get tighter. And on top of that, if you bet and get check raised, you're in a difficult situation and you probably have to fold. So it's very dependent on the strength of all four cards together, whether you want to bet or check with that specific hand class. Again, we already know that my hand, King, King, Jack 3, is a very easy c-bet. Okay. We looked into our overall range, then we now learned that you can zoom in and look at your hand class, and from that hand class you want to zoom in further to your specific hand and look at all the four cards that you have and make a decision based on that. We also know that range versus range interaction has a massive effect on your overall c-bet strategy. So whether you bet with a very high frequency, a medium frequency, or a low frequency. Now there is another thing that is extremely important, and that is, are you in position or are you out of position? In this situation, early position versus big blind, we play a spot where we are in position, of course, and being in position is a massive advantage in pot limit Omaha. And that is because you already have information about your opponent because he did check to you. And because you have that informational advantage and you can act last on every street, you will have a massive advantage. And that will have an impact also on your overall expected value. It's much more likely to realize or over-realize the equity of your specific hand when you're in position than when you're out of position. Now let's change the positions a bit. Let's say we open raise from early position and this time the button calls. In that situation, we are now out of position versus in position against the big blind. So early position versus button, being out of position, things change drastically. Of course, my opponent's range will become stronger, so the button's calling range is stronger and tighter than the range from the big blind. So we're playing against a tighter range. And that will have an effect because now we will be in a less large of a range advantage. And on top of that, and maybe more importantly, we are out of position. And the fact that we are out of position now makes us being in a disadvantageous spot because we have to act first on flop and potential turn and river. And that gives us a much more difficult situation basically because our opponent knows based on what we do more than what we right now know about our opponent because our opponent hasn't acted yet. So in a lot of situations, when you are out of position, your c-bet frequency will have to drop dramatically. On a Queen 9 deuce, for example, our c-bet frequency drops from 45% against the big blind to less than 10% against the button. And that is not only because of different ranges, but more importantly also because we are out of position. The nuts is going to change very often on flop to turn to river, and because that is the case and we having to act first, we have to be quite selective with the hands that we want to bet with, because a strong hand on the flop is not necessarily going to be a strong hand on turns and rivers. So a much lower overall range c-bet in this situation against the button, for example, and that would mean that my specific hand against the button would actually much rather check and versus a stab probably go for a check raise rather than go for a bet and having to play a multi-street game out of position. Now, of course, my hand is still extremely strong versus the button, but it's more about the conceptual idea. If you move from being in position to being out of position in a high SPR situation, on almost any texture, in almost any situation, you're going to do a ton of checking. And your c-bet frequency is extremely low. Now, the most common exceptions from that are when the board is ace high. In that situation, the out of position player is in a large range advantage and therefore he can still support a decent amount of betting. Or when you play small blind versus big blind, and in that situation, the big blind's defending range is so wide that on many of the board textures, the out of position player can actually still do a significant amount of betting because his range advantage again is still strong enough that he can support a good amount of betting. Now, lastly, before wrapping up this video, guys, I want to point out one more thing, and that is that in many situations, you can almost simplify your flop c-bet strategy by using a couple of easy heuristics. Let's imagine you have your full range. Let's say these are all your hands within this range. You have some hands that are very weak, you have some hands that are in the middle, and then you have some hands that are very strong. Now let's start off with the last segment, the very strong hands. In almost any situation, you want to bet the majority of those hands in that very strong category. Those hands want to build a pot, push equity versus your opponents, and benefit from playing a larger pot, basically. Now, the exception in that range, basically, is the very, very top end of that range. Quite often, if you are in a situation and you are completely crushing the board, those hands often want to slow play because the likelihood of building a pot is quite low because you're blocking so much that if you bet, your opponent is so often going to fold that you rather check, slow play, and try to induce something from your opponent. Now, within that medium strong to weak range, there are a lot of hands, and the majority of those hands, they don't necessarily benefit from building a pot. And the reason is because those hands don't push a lot of equity versus your opponent's range. they don't have a lot of additional components in it that benefit from a larger pot and therefore can do a lot of barreling on turns and rivers. And lastly, you have to think about that a lot of these medium strong hands, if they bet and get check raised, they most likely have to fold and they have to leave a significant amount of equity on the table. So the majority of your medium strong to weak hands generally want to check back and keep the pot small. Now the exception within that range is when hands within that category have so many additional components to it, even though their overall equity is not crushing as much, that they still benefit from betting. A good example often is like a one pair hand with a flush blocker and a backdoor flush draw, for example. Like that hand in terms of equity is still often medium strong, but because you have a pair blocker and you have a flush draw blocker and you have a backdoor flush draw, you are stacking so many components that those hands quite often prefer betting over checking. Now lastly, we have the air, right? Like the weakest hands in your range, and those hands play very dependent on the additional components in it and the additional cards. It's very easy to say you want to bet your best hands and you want to bet your worst hands, but that's not really how it works, because so many hands in that weak part, in the air portion basically, are so weak that they cannot support a bet. So what you're looking for in the air region is that you need some form of additional blocker or some form of backup equity in order to justify a bet. The classic example on Queen 9 deuce with a suit, for example, is the bare ace of diamonds. If you don't have anything else really, that hand has very, very low equity. But because you have such a strong blocker, you can still justify a bet because you are blocking your opponent's continuing range, and on a lot of the runouts you can actually support double or triple barreling. So always consider that from the total air portion you need at least some solid blocker or strong backdoor equity in order to justify a bet, and you cannot get away with just betting all your air. There is so much trash in that those hands are just burning money if you bet all of them. Now, of course, everything that we mentioned today, it's quite statically related to the flop, right? Like poker is not a flop game. It's a pre-flop to river game. There are multiple streets you have to play, and every decision that you make on the flop can only be as good if you also understand turn and river. So yes, certain hands are clear flop bets or clear flop checks basically, but it also takes into account that you understand how to play turn and river correctly. So what I'm trying to say is that if you are studying flop c-betting, and if you have this question in game, should I bet or should I check, go through the things that we mentioned today. And on top of that, also think about like, what do I know about turn and river strategy with this hand? For example, king, king, jack 3, of course, we have a lot of things going on. So a lot of turns are good. A diamond is good for me. A 10 is good. A king is good. Hearts are often good. There aren't that many bad cards for my range or for my hand on the turn, and therefore I can support a lot of betting. But if you are extremely unsure about should I bet my hand on the turn on like most of the runouts, then the answer of betting the flop is quite often not, because if that hand cannot support a lot of turn and river barrels, then it's often better to check back and basically keep the pot small. So I hope you guys find some value in this video about flop c-betting basically. Again, if you like the content, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. If you have any questions or ideas or suggestions, feel free to share them below in the comments. I'm looking forward to your feedback on this specific topic, and also let me know what you're looking for in future episodes here on my YouTube channel. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Over and out. This is Luke. Catch you guys in the next one. Bye.